All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. I'm going to get right into another Bible Decode, number 118. This is more on the Flavian signature. We're looking at a book from Michael Maniscat's, just came out in about October of 2024, called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. The Flavians were a dynasty of Caesars who lived and ruled from Rome from 69 to 96 AD. They were Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian, and his two sons, Emperor Titus and Emperor Domitian. And the theory goes, according to several authors at this point, that almost innumerable authors of literature, that the New Testament was written by the Romans. The Romans wrote it as a psychological operation to stymie or domesticate or prune or mellow out the Jews. The Jews were a big thorn in the side of the Romans ever since the Romans kind of took over in Judea about 63 BC. They fought constant wars against what's known as the Maccabee dynasty of the Jews up until Herod, the king, kind of took over there. Even though Herod was a Maccabee, he was some people say he was a Maccabee. He was a very compliant ruler for the Romans. But even after that, there were constant insurrections and revolts and uprisings that the Romans had to deal with. And the Romans were happy to put these things down with vengeance, but it took a lot of their resources to constantly be patrolling and putting down the Jews. They had so many other tribes and nations under their empire, excuse me, that they didn't have the resources to, put all this attention on the Jews. The Jews were the most difficult people that they had to govern, and that's because they had this this monotheistic God who called them the chosen people, and had a whole lot of strange and idiosyncratic rituals that the Jews had to perform to stay, in good stead with their God, including kosher food laws, animal sacrifice, strictures against graven images, circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, all these different things. And these all were very inconvenient, if not worse, for the for the Romans. But then the culmination came with the Jewish War. It started in 66 AD, and the Jews, the Zealot Jews under Simon, John, and Eleazar, basically ejected the Romans from Jerusalem. And Emperor Nero had to send in General Vespasian in a full military effort to put down the Jews and siege Jerusalem. Eventually, Nero was assassinated, and that led to a series of events, including 3 more emperors being assassinated, before General Vespasian was given the call in about 69 AD to become the new emperor. So he gave the reins of the military command over to his son Titus, and Vespasian became emperor. Titus kept fighting and eventually defeated the Jews in about 73 AD, and he eventually also became emperor when Vespasian died in 79 AD. Both Titus and Vespasian were injured in the war, and they both had an axe to grind against the Jews. The Jews were also waiting for a Messiah, predicted in the Old Testament in many different places. And the environment in Judea was that a Messiah was coming, and it could have possibly been Eleazar, John, and Simon, or could have possibly been Judas the Galilean earlier, or other people. But that was the environment that was there, that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, and that Messiah was a military leader who was going to help the Jews overthrow the Romans or whoever the colonial power was occupying Jerusalem and Judea. And so the Romans, being masters of psychological warfare and propaganda, decided to write up a story that they backdated by 40 years so that they could kind of put a distance between this and themselves. And they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Judea, and that the Romans should be forgiven, for they know not what they do, and that we should walk an extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack. And when we are going to be militant and stand up for ourselves, we're going to stand up against the Jews and not the Romans. And so when we decide to overturn the tables outside the temple, we are overturning the Jewish tables, who are exchanging Roman money, which has graven images on it, for Jewish money, which doesn't, so that you could bring it into the temple. And we're going to overturn the commerce of the people who are selling doves and pigeons outside the temple for their animal sacrifice rituals. So when we are going to uprise, we're going to do it in order to bring down the Jewish rituals, the animal sacrifice ritual, the temple itself, and many other aspects of the Jewish practices were neutralized by Jesus in the Gospels. And at the same time that they wrote the Gospels, they also wrote a companion story that was set up in the present time, or in the recent past, which was a history of the War of the Jews. And they wrote this under the name of Flavius Josephus. A Flavian. Josephus, even according to his autobiography, was writing this from Caesar's palace at Rome. And it comes out in 7 volumes, and it is a companion piece to the New Testament. When you compare them, there are so many parallels that would make your head spin. And that's what Michael Menescotz did in this book. He compared War of the Jews by Josephus, who is probably a pseudonym of one of the Roman nobility, close family members of Titus and Vespasian, probably this guy named Arius Piso. And the book of Luke. And just in the book of Luke, Menescotz found 250 parallels with the War of the Jews. And he goes through those kind of painstakingly in this book here. Not only that, but he diagrams all of the parallels, puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis and Josephus on the horizontal axis, and he puts a dot every place that there is a corresponding parallel. And what we find is that when all is said and done, those parallels make 5 near-perfect letters in Latin. APTVS, Arius, Piso, Titus, Vespasian. So the Romans, not only did they write the Gospels, but they literally signed their name to it, or at least put their initials on them. And there are many different themes of the parallels. In general, the Romans are using this in order to mock the Jews, as well as neutralize them or domesticate them. The tenor of the parallels is grim, brutal, mean-spirited, mocking, insulting, pornographic, and even cannibalistic. And also homosexual, in addition to all of those things. And so if you are a Christian, you should pay attention to this stuff, because you're being mocked by this script of the New Testament, and you wouldn't know it unless you opened up Josephus. And why should you open up Josephus? Because Josephus is, for you, he is the only evidence that corroborates the existence of Jesus. Josephus is the only author from the 1st century outside of the Gospels to corroborate the existence of Jesus. So for you, Josephus is like a hero, and he is also known as one of the great historians of antiquity, if not of all time. His War of the Jews, I think, is one of the greatest selling books ever. And it used to be part of the Bible for many different sects, and still is part of the canonical Bible according to the preterist sect. So we're going to go over a lot of these parallels. Another thing about the Romans is that they had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on publishing. They had a monopoly on distribution. And so that would have made all of these things feasible, to put out hundreds or thousands of copies of the Gospels and get them distributed throughout the empire. But those things did not exist for the semi-literate followers of Jesus in Judea who spoke Aramaic, while the New Testament is written in Greek, which was a common language in Rome and much less common in Judea. Only the elite would speak, much less write, in Greek. Okay, now we're here talking about, let's go back to just the beginning of this segment here. So why do historians seem to have as much faith in Josephus's historicity as Christians do in Jesus? So he's asking, why do historians believe that Josephus is legit and that Josephus even existed? Because the story he tells has so many holes in it, and is so many flights of fancy and things that just can't possibly be true. But nonetheless, he's taken at his word as a writer of history. I think Vespasian's propaganda team knew that they were at risk of making Josephus seem too implausible. They needed people to believe Josephus was a real person, because if the early converts to Jesus figured the truth out, they wouldn't trust Jewish war, and therefore couldn't be led to accept Titus as the second coming. Okay, so Titus, the military general, eventually the emperor for the Romans, he is a parallel of Jesus. So the things that Jesus predicts in the gospel, Titus fulfills in Josephus. So there are many predictions that Jesus makes that are fulfilled by Titus. And the places where Jesus makes the predictions are the same places that Titus fulfills them. And the date that Jesus makes the predictions is 40 years to the day from when Titus fulfills them. Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea. Everywhere that Jesus goes, Titus goes, in the same order, and they encounter the same conceptual situations at each of these locations. Now, they're not identical situations, but they're conceptually the same. Okay, so what that does is it sets up a trap for Christians, that you believe that in Jesus, but really Jesus is predicting his second coming, and his second coming is Titus, the emperor. And so you can, forget about your book of Revelation and the second coming, because this already happened according to Josephus's writing. But they didn't want to delete those implausible passages of text, since each one served a purpose. So they went to great lengths to convince people that Josephus was real. For one, they published an autobiography in his name. But obviously it would be more convincing if a variety of politically active writers were to mention in passing that they knew him in person. Better yet, they should write innocuous private letters to each other on unrelated topics, mentioning that they knew Josephus personally, with those letters just happening to end up being widely circulated. Indeed, either Tacitus did this, or else someone published such letters in Tacitus's name, which of course would be a trivially easy thing for a government to do. While it is clearly contrary to the mainstream view, this really shouldn't be such an extraordinary idea. We know from modern dictatorships that controlling all news, media, and public narrative is a priority, and that creating fake news outlets of every form is a standard tactic. The Roman Empire was the epitome of an extreme dictatorship. And since... Okay, sorry, I gotta turn the page right here. And since handwritten letters were the only form of distance communication, this would be what the government would want to control and distort. On a related note, there have been many ancient writers claiming that the Romans persecuted early Christians, including even Nero, in this very early period. Nero was assassinated in 68 AD. To the point that this is the most well-known fact about the Romans. We even teach it to school children before they reach the age of reason. Yet nobody questions why. Why would the Romans persecute a religion that promoted rendering tax to Caesar and acceptance of inequality, oppression, and slavery in preference to Judaism, which did the opposite and was Rome's main enemy? It doesn't even make sense. The simple answer is that these publications are government propaganda originating from under different political rulers. Each publication masquerading as independent writing. Together they are successful in making it almost impossible for people to imagine that Jesus' story was created by the Romans, or indeed that most of the details of Jesus' story were invented after Nero's death. I wouldn't really say invented, I think really borrowed. A lot of the stories in Jesus' New Testament are borrowed from earlier stories of people like Attis, Phrygia, and Dionysus, and Jupiter or Juno, and there are also a lot of parts that are brought in of the philosophical bent that are from the Stoics, like Seneca, who was definitely in on this, Seneca the Younger, and some Neoplatonists, as well as ancient Egyptian mythology and Sumerian mythology. So a lot of the aspects of the New Testament were borrowed from these other sources, as well as the Old Testament. Right there in the very beginning of Matthew, there are parallel after parallel between the story of Jesus in Matthew, first 4 or so chapters, and the story of Moses in Egypt, in Egypt and then to Judea. So I think those are in starting at Genesis 45 and going into the beginning of Exodus. So, those definitely need to be explained as well, because they are pretty much the same story in a number of different details. Okay, summary. Demonstrating Josephus' life story to be a fiction has significant consequences. Yes, absolutely. Because Josephus and the New Testament are really the only surviving documents from this whole time period. So if we don't have those, we have nothing, except for the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were only discovered 75 or 80 years ago. They may have been from this time period also. But who knows whether those are real either. So those are written mostly in Hebrew, some in Aramaic, and then a few in Greek, I believe. So we can no longer judge historical sources to be trustworthy solely because they are backed up by one or two others. And where we have done so, we may have accepted government-generated fake news as historical fact. While that was a remarkable series of parallels that he went through comparing Josephus' life story and Jesus' life story, which is one of several different themes of all of these parallels, it still was not the complete list of how the second half of Jewish War parodies Luke. Before I conclude with the discussion of what all this proves, I will now list those parallels which do not specifically involve Josephus' life story. These help to finish the left-hand side of the T in the diagram. You can see the thumbnail for the video to see the whole diagram, thereby completing the last 3 letters of the APTVS signature. Continuing the parody of Jesus' story, Jewish War describes a John as the worst, most wicked person and associate the Pharisees with hypocrisy in conjunction with a great crowd crushing together. And this is John, the Jewish zealot, who was one of the leaders of the Jews. The revolution, and then compared with the John in the New Testament, the author of the 4th Gospel. Okay, this is from Luke 7:28. There is no greater prophet than John, but everyone in the kingdom of God is greater than John. Therefore, John is the worst person in the kingdom of God. Luke 12:1, in the meantime, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, so much that they trod upon one another, he began to say to his disciples, first of all, beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. And there we have Jesus going off on the Jews again, as opposed to the Romans. Okay, now this is paired up with Jewish War, paragraph 354. That's book 2, chapter 21, paragraph 1. There arose a man called John, who he says is described as a Pharisee. Okay, maybe this is a different John then. There arose a man called John Levi of Gischala. He was a hypocritical pretender to humanity. John had no equal anywhere in wicked practices, a thief and a liar, and treacherous deluder. And he got certain companions, at first few, and then still more and more numerous. Ultimately, John got 100,000 armed men crowded into the hippodrome. Such that, so the two parallels that he's finding there are that John is the worst person. In Luke, John is the worst person in the kingdom of heaven. Here, he had no equal anywhere in wicked practices. And then the crowds that are trotting upon one another. Ultimately, John got 100,000 armed men crowded into the hippodrome. And in Luke, it says there were gathered a numerous multitude of people, so much that they trod upon one another. That's a parallel, but it's not a very strong one. I'd say that's another kind of a parallel that's just really there to put the dot there. You know, when you have 250 parallels, they're not all going to be very strong, but they have to be at least bona fide so that, you know, if you're looking for it, you can find it. That's, you know, you really kind of have to be looking for that to be able to find it. Okay. And mirroring Luke, Jewish war describes John accepting that he was the lesser compared to a mightier person, discussing the gathering of corn on the Sabbath and the relationship of fire to buildings and someone being at another person's feet. So I don't know if this is John the Baptist this time. Luke 3:15. And all men mused whether John was the Christ. John said, but one mightier than I cometh, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to unloose. And he shall baptize you with fire and with the Holy Ghost, and whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor, and will gather the wheat into the storehouse, into his storehouse, but the chaff he will burn with fire unquenchable. And then he also goes to Luke 6:1. And it happened on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. And certain of the Pharisees said to them, why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? Now, this is paired up with Jewish War 360, Book 2, Chapter 21, Paragraph 7. Now, these are all in the T. You can see that because they're all Jewish War 360, 361, 362. So they're all vertical in a vertical line because Luke is on the vertical axis. So they're different places in Luke, but they're pretty much in the same couple paragraphs in Josephus. So that's the T. That's the vertical line in the T. John fled to Gischala, and the Galileans came from their cities to Josephus, crying out that they were come against John, and at the same time they would burn him and his city. Josephus announced that he would burn their families with fire, and also burn their houses if they did not renounce John. So 3,000 of John's party left him for Josephus and threw their arms down at his feet. Josephus then sent out his soldiers to gather the corn, forage, because the following day was the Sabbath. Okay, so I think that's a little bit better. Both have to do with the John, both have to do with fire, burning burning a fire and a house and corn gathering and the Sabbath and throwing down at their feet. He says, the latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to unloose. And here he says, threw their arms down at his feet. So we have several, even though you probably, if you read the two next to each other, you still probably wouldn't notice the parallels unless you were looking for them. But if you're looking for them, you see the John burning houses, corn, Sabbath, and feet. All of those different themes are involved in both of those stories. Okay, and mirroring Luke, Jewish War describes a discussion of the sale of oil at double price, but also a ruler gaining tenfold profit. So remember this from Luke 16:5. A rich man called his debtors, asking how much he owns, and he said 100 measures of oil. And he said, take your bill and quickly write 50. Divide it in two. Luke 19:13, a nobleman went to receive a country for himself and gave them 10 pounds, saying, occupy until I come. When he returned, the first said, your pound has gained 10 pounds, which is a tenfold profit. And this is paired up with Jewish War 355. So that's a little bit farther over on the diagram, but still it probably is in the T, but it's a little bit off. To raise funds, John bought 4 amphorae of oil for 4 drachmae and sold half an amphora for the same price. And Josephus' autobiography mirrors this, indicating that the profit was tenfold. So I guess that's just it. Tenfold profit of oil. Selling half. Okay, I think that pretty much does it for today's parallels. We're going to get into something tomorrow on a new page, so I won't even know what it is. I guess I'm taking a sneak peek here, see if he stays in the same vein or where we're going here. Yeah, some more of these parallels that are kind of a little bit more random, but are making up the T. And thanks for tuning in today. And like, share, subscribe, and comment. Please return tomorrow for the next episode. Have a great night.